The night had settled over London like a heavy curtain, smothering the bomb-blackened rooftops beneath a sky thick with mist and coal smoke. Downing Street, usually a corridor of footmen, secretaries and whispered urgency, lay almost eerily quiet. It was shortly after midnight on May 10, 1940, a date the British government would later regard with the same reverence as a battlefield victory. Hours earlier, Winston Churchill had been summoned to Buckingham Palace to accept the King's commission as Prime Minister. Now, as he stepped into the residence where he would wage the most perilous fight of his life, he carried not triumph but dread. Germany had invaded Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. France was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force was at risk of encirclement. And Britain itself stood on the brink of annihilation. Churchill knew it, felt it, inhaled it with every breath of the cold London air. This was not a moment of ascent. It was a descent into fire. Inside number 10, dim lights burned in only a handful of rooms. Wartime economy and blackout rules ensured that even the seat of government looked subdued, almost monastic. Churchill walked through the narrow corridors, past the portraits of prime ministers long gone, men whose greatest challenges seemed trivial compared to the storm about to engulf him. He paused at the cabinet room, its long polished table gleaming faintly beneath the shaded lamps. This was where he would confront the doubters, the appeasers, the exhausted men who had lived through the failures of the 1930s and no longer trusted their own judgment. He did not yet know how fiercely he would have to wrestle them into unity. But he sensed, with the intuition that had guided him through decades of political exile, that the true battle for Britain would begin not on the beaches or in the air, but here in these cramped, half-lit rooms. The permanent secretaries and junior ministers who lingered in the hallway looked at him with a mixture of awe and apprehension. They knew Churchill as the roarer, the warmonger, the man whose warnings about Hitler had earned him ridicule in Parliament. Now those same warnings had become prophecy. Many feared he would drag Britain into reckless bloodshed. Others hoped he was the only man who could hold the nation together. Churchill ignored their stares and moved with deliberate slowness, grounding himself with every step. The weight of responsibility felt almost physical, as if invisible hands pressed down on his shoulders, reminding him that the entire British Empire, from Singapore to Halifax, lay in his grasp. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if Lloyd George had felt the same on the eve of the Great War. The thought passed quickly. He had no time for ghosts. He entered the map room, a space thick with cigarette smoke, where officers bent over vast charts of Europe, marking the German advance with tiny black pins that moved farther west every hour. A young naval officer began to rise when Churchill entered, but Churchill waved him back down. He leaned over the maps, studying the jagged front line that stretched from the Ardennes to the North Sea. The speed of the German assault was breathtaking. No one on the British General Staff had predicted such a rapid collapse of the Low Countries. As he stared at the black pins threatening to encircle the British forces in Belgium, he felt a surge of cold fury at Hitler's treachery, at the folly of appeasement, at the sheer weight of the disaster unfolding. Yet he did not permit despair even in private. His mind sharpened. His pulse steadied. Crisis to him was oxygen. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, he convened his first meeting as Prime Minister. It was not yet a formal war cabinet session. Those would begin in daylight, with stenographers and documents, but a midnight gathering of the few men who would shape Britain's fate in the next 72 hours. Clement Attlee arrived first, quiet and observant, followed by Anthony Eden, who still carried the bitterness of resigning over appeasement. Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary and Churchill's chief rival for the premiership, entered last. Halifax's presence chilled the room. He was calm, urbane, and deeply opposed to Churchill's instincts. Even now, at the moment of Britain's gravest danger, he leaned toward exploring peace terms with Germany. Churchill knew that this midnight council would set the tone for all future conflict between them, and that unless he proved unshakable, Halifax's caution could smother Britain's will to resist. The men gathered around the small table in Churchill's study, lit only by a reading lamp that cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. Outside, the distant thud of anti-aircraft fire echoed faintly. The Luftwaffe was testing London again. Churchill opened the meeting not with bravado but with a frank assessment of catastrophe. France was nearing the breaking point. Belgium's defenses were almost gone. The British Expeditionary Force might soon need a miracle to escape Dunkirk's sands. He spoke slowly, methodically, forcing each man to confront the scale of the crisis without offering even a sliver of delusion. This was Churchill at his most dangerous and his most effective, not theatrical but solemn, not inspiring but electrifying. His voice carried the weight of inevitability, as though he were not describing events but shaping them. Halifax countered with icy precision. He argued that Britain must consider approaching Mussolini, who still maintained diplomatic channels with Hitler, to explore the conditions of peace. Halifax framed it as prudence, not surrender. Churchill, however, saw it exactly for what it was: the first step toward national suicide. He responded not with fury but with chilling clarity, laying out the consequences of negotiation: loss of freedom, dismemberment of empire, and a humiliation that would haunt Britain for generations. The room fell silent. Churchill understood that this was the moment on which the entire war might pivot. If Halifax prevailed tonight, Britain's story would end before it truly began. What followed was not debate but a contest of wills. Attlee and Eden quietly aligned with Churchill, giving him the political flank he needed. Halifax persisted, but gradually Churchill's gravity overwhelmed the room. Something shifted in that cramped study, a subtle, almost imperceptible turning of the tide. Churchill felt it like a change in air pressure. The resistance ebbed. The inertia of fear began to crack. Without raising his voice, he had done what he had always done best: bend the moment to his will. When the meeting finally ended, just before dawn, Churchill stepped alone into the corridor. The building was silent except for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock. He paused, his hand on the banister, aware that he had just fought the first great battle of his premiership, and won. Not with armies, not with speeches, but with resolve. In that midnight meeting he had preserved Britain's willingness to fight on, no matter the cost, no matter the darkness ahead. And as he walked back toward the cabinet room, he felt a strange, fierce calm settle over him. The war had entered its most perilous phase, but Britain had found its spine. The man who had long been dismissed as a has-been had, in a single night, seized the destiny of a nation. Dawn crept over London with a grey, reluctant light, the kind that seemed to seep rather than shine. Churchill had slept only an hour, collapsing briefly in the small bedroom adjoining his study, yet he rose with the same restless intensity that had carried him through the night. Outside, the city was stirring: milk carts on the cobblestones, boots on pavements, the sigh of buses beginning their routes. It all felt tragically normal for a nation facing oblivion. Inside Number 10, the tension coiled like a living thing. Today he would meet the full war cabinet for the first time as Prime Minister, and he knew the fault line revealed in the midnight meeting would widen in daylight. Britain's top ministers were divided not by policy alone but by the psychological wreckage of the 1930s: fear of another continental bloodbath, fear of internal collapse, fear that Britain was simply too small and too lonely to stand against Germany. Churchill's greatest opponent was not Halifax, it was despair. By mid-morning, telegrams from France arrived with devastating clarity. The German breakthrough at Sedan had turned into a bloody eruption, ripping open the French line. Reports indicated that the French government was near panic, some ministers already whispering about armistice. Churchill read the dispatches without blinking, but inside he felt the cold throb of dread. The collapse of France would leave Britain alone, without allies, without a foothold on the continent, and with barely enough trained troops to defend its own shores. He carried the telegrams under his arm as he headed into the cabinet room, knowing they were both a warning and a weapon. Halifax would use them to argue for peace. Churchill would use them to argue for resolve. It was an ideological duel fought not with philosophy, but with the raw arithmetic of war. The room filled slowly, each man taking his usual seat as though muscle memory could shield them from the gravity of the moment. The long table gleamed with the sheen of age, the head of it reserved for Churchill. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of tobacco, old paper, and suppressed anxiety. Halifax sat with impeccable posture, his expression one of solemn inevitability, as if he were merely waiting for events to vindicate him. Chamberlain, the recently displaced Prime Minister and still a formidable figure in the party, settled beside him with a somber, inward gaze. Churchill watched the two men carefully. They represented the old governing class, calm, aristocratic, convinced that empire was best preserved through negotiation rather than confrontation. They believed in stability. Churchill believed in defiance. The session began with a brutally honest review of the military situation. Churchill paced slowly as he spoke, the telegrams in hand, dictating their contents as though delivering clinical evidence at a trial. Every detail was bleak: French units disintegrating, roads choked with refugees, commanders losing contact with their own armies. The shock in the room was palpable. This was not the war Britain had prepared for, nor the war its generals had imagined. Halifax seized the moment, arguing in measured tones that Britain must consider whether fighting alone was a noble sacrifice or a futile suicide. He noted that if France fell, Britain could no longer expect to hold the Mediterranean, and the home islands themselves would be exposed to direct attack. His argument was not treachery but prudence, cold, rational and deeply persuasive. Yet Churchill understood the hidden danger within Halifax's reasoning. Once Britain opened diplomatic channels with Germany, it would be nearly impossible to disengage. Hitler would offer terms that seemed tolerable at first, perhaps colonial concessions, perhaps demilitarization of the Channel ports, yet the long-term cost would be nothing less than the enslavement of Europe and the moral destruction of Britain. Churchill framed his counterargument in historical rather than strategic terms. He invoked the centuries-long struggle for European liberty, the sacrifices of previous generations, the British tradition of resisting continental tyrannies from Napoleon to the Kaiser. He spoke not of what Britain might lose by fighting, but of what it would cease to be if it surrendered. His rhetoric, even stripped of its more famous flourishes, carried a force that transcended policy. He reminded them that history never forgives hesitation in the face of evil. The debate stretched into hours, punctuated by cigarette breaks and stiff cups of tea delivered by pale, anxious clerks. The mood shifted subtly but steadily. Chamberlain, whose prestige had once towered over the cabinet, now appeared spiritually exhausted. He had lost the trust of the nation after Munich, yet he held a lingering authority with ministers who feared radical change. Churchill watched him closely. Chamberlain's stance would determine whether Halifax's argument gained momentum. But as the discussion continued, Chamberlain began to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward Churchill. Perhaps it was the weight of responsibility, perhaps a flicker of moral recognition. But whatever the cause, Chamberlain saw that negotiating with Hitler would vindicate the very appeasement that had led them here. His silence began to speak louder than Halifax's words. What Churchill could not yet articulate but felt instinctively, was that this was not merely a debate about strategy. It was a psychological reckoning, a moment when the British governing elite had to confront its own failure to understand the nature of Hitler's regime. For years they had imagined despots in the old European mold, corrupt, power-hungry but bargain-able. Hitler was something far more terrifying, a revolutionary tyrant who sought not advantage but domination. Churchill sensed this deeply long before many others. In these early days of his premiership, he became the interpreter of a new kind of danger, forcing the cabinet to see that traditional diplomacy was obsolete in the face of ideological fanaticism. By the time the meeting adjourned, the cabinet was no more united than before, but the balance had shifted. Halifax had not yet been defeated, but his momentum was breaking. Churchill felt the crack in his opponent's argument the way a general senses the first faltering in an enemy's line. It was small, almost invisible but decisive. As he left the room, exhausted yet electrically alert, he knew the next sessions would determine whether Britain chose survival through struggle or survival through surrender. One path led into fire, the other into darkness. Churchill had already chosen his path. Now he had to bring the nation with him. As the next day unfolded, the crisis widened beyond Britain's walls. Paris, once the heartbeat of European culture, now pulsed with fear. German armor rolled through the Ardennes at a pace that shocked even the Wehrmacht commanders. Dispatches arriving in London described scenes that bordered on the apocalyptic. Ministries packing archives into trucks, civilians fleeing with mattresses strapped to bicycles, government officials arguing in corridors about whether to relocate south. Churchill read each report with a grim understanding that France was not merely faltering, it was unraveling. And with every French retreat, Britain's peril grew. The British Expeditionary Force, positioned deep within Belgium, risked being cut off entirely. Churchill felt the tightening noose, not just around the armies, but around the entire strategy of the Western Allies. A collapse in France could trigger collapse in London, not militarily but psychologically. And that was the threat Halifax counted on. That afternoon, the French government sent an urgent request for Churchill to visit Paris. Though exhausted from 2 days of ceaseless deliberation, he agreed instantly. He needed to see the situation himself, not just to understand France's condition, but to judge whether its leaders still possessed the will to fight. If France was preparing to capitulate, Britain's internal debate would become even more fraught. The flight to Paris was tense and silent, Churchill staring through the window at the Channel's gray waves, the clouds hanging low like mourning drapes. When he landed and was driven through Parisian boulevards, the city no longer resembled the confident capital he had known in peacetime. Sandbags framed ministry doors. Camouflage nets hung over statues. Teams of soldiers dug trenches in parks where children once played. France's collapse was no longer a hypothetical, it was taking physical form. Inside the Élysée Palace, Churchill met Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, whose face bore the exhaustion of a man who had not slept in days. Reynaud's first words were bleak. France could no longer guarantee that Paris would hold. The German breakthrough threatened to split the nation in two. Churchill pressed him, were the French armies finished? Reynaud insisted they would fight on, but Churchill sensed desperation beneath the words. The French army was brave, but bravery could not compensate for broken communication lines, shattered logistics, and the psychological shock of defeat. The once proud French General Staff now spoke not of counterattacks, but of withdrawals and temporary regroupings, euphemisms for concessions to reality. Churchill realized he was watching a government slip into resignation, as though the weight of history had become too heavy to lift. Yet even amidst the despair, he attempted to infuse hope. He spoke passionately of British support, of plans to reinforce the French front, of the need to rally national will. But as he looked around the room, he saw eyes that no longer sparkled with resolve. France suffered not only military crisis but spiritual collapse. Later, as he walked the palace corridors, the truth struck him with brutal clarity. If France fell, Britain would truly stand alone. And if Britain's leaders were divided today, they would be torn apart tomorrow. The fight in London was not a political quarrel, it was the prelude to a national existential test. Halifax's argument for negotiation would grow louder with every French retreat. Churchill had to fortify not just the British army but the British soul. Back in London that evening, Churchill convened another cabinet session, his voice still hoarse from Paris. He relayed the grimness of what he had witnessed, yet he framed it not as a justification for despair, but as a summons to courage. He argued that Britain must prepare for the possibility of French collapse without allowing it to dictate British policy. Halifax countered sharply, insisting that if even France, Europe's largest army, could not hold, Britain had no hope alone. Prudence, he said softly, must guide us. Churchill answered with a steel that shocked even his allies. Prudence, he declared, must never be confused with surrender. The room froze. The fault line was no longer subtle. It had become the central battlefield of the British government. The stakes grew clearer with each hour. For Halifax, negotiating with Hitler was not submission but damage control, an attempt to salvage Britain's empire and avoid invasion. For Churchill, negotiation was a cancer that would devour Britain's very identity. He reminded the cabinet that Hitler's terms could never be trusted. Even if Britain preserved nominal independence, it would become a vassal state, stripped of influence, humiliated before the world, and forced to watch the destruction of European freedom. Churchill spoke with a conviction forged from years of studying dictatorships. He understood that tyranny did not respect compromise. It consumed compromise. The cabinet listened in tense silence, each man wrestling with the terrifying magnitude of the decision before them. Behind these debates lay a deeper truth few ministers dared articulate. Britain had entered a new kind of war, one that would not be decided solely by tanks or aircraft, but by narrative, by morale, by the inner constitution of a people. Churchill's instinct, his genius, was to recognize that the psychological front mattered as much as the physical one. If the cabinet wavered now, the nation would waver. If the cabinet stood firm, the nation would discover within itself a defiance that had been dormant. The German threat was horrific, but the threat of internal collapse was worse. Churchill was determined to prevent that collapse at any cost. Late that night, after the ministers had left, he walked alone through the quiet corridors of Downing Street. The building seemed smaller than it had that morning, as though the weight of the world had pressed its walls inward. He entered the map room once more, staring at the darkening chaos in France and the narrowing avenues of British survival. Yet even amid the despair, he sensed a strange clarity. The moment of decision was coming, swiftly, inevitably. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the British government looked into the abyss, he would compel them to choose defiance. He would force history's hand even if he had to drag it through fire. The next days brought catastrophe with a rhythm so relentless it felt almost mechanical. News arrived that Belgium's defenses had crumbled, their army collapsing under the pressure of German armored thrusts. King Leopold, overwhelmed and isolated, was rumored to be preparing to capitulate. For Britain, this was not merely another European nation yielding to Hitler, it was the collapse of the northern flank, the very shield protecting the British Expeditionary Force from complete encirclement. Churchill read the reports in a silence that concealed volcanic anger. The dominoes were falling exactly as he had long warned, but there was no satisfaction in being right. Each loss tightened the German grip and deepened Britain's isolation. And yet, paradoxically, the growing darkness gave Churchill clarity. Nothing remained of the old illusions. Britain must now fight not to win glory or defend allies, but simply to survive. The war cabinet met again in a building trembling with urgency. Far from calming the dispute between Churchill and Halifax, each new disaster intensified it. Halifax spoke with a coolness that bordered on fatalism. With Belgium gone, France faltering, and the British army at risk of annihilation, he argued that Britain's military position was untenable. The possibility of invasion loomed larger every hour. Given these realities, Halifax insisted, Britain must explore terms, not surrender but negotiation, before defeat made negotiation impossible. His argument was not cowardice, it was the logical progression of traditional diplomacy. Yet Churchill saw within it a peril more deadly than any panzer division. To him, negotiation while Britain still had armies in the field would project weakness that Hitler would exploit mercilessly. It was the psychology of the moment that mattered. Britain must appear unbreakable, even if, behind the scenes, its leaders trembled. For Churchill, the heart of the struggle lay not in military arithmetic but in moral calculus. He spoke of the centuries-old lineage of British liberty, of a people who had resisted tyranny in all its forms. He reminded the cabinet of how Britain had stood alone before, against Philip II, against Napoleon, and emerged stronger by refusing to bow. But Halifax saw such invocations as sentimental. Britain's power was no longer imperial. The empire lacked the cohesion it once had. The dominions were unsure, India restless, and the United States cautious and distant. Britain could not simply rely on mythic memories of island defiance. Halifax urged pragmatic assessment. Even with Churchill's determination, Britain's defenses were thin, its resources strained, and its army trapped far from home. If the Germans sealed the Channel, no rhetoric could reverse the defeat. Churchill countered with a truth Halifax avoided confronting. Negotiating with Hitler meant trusting Hitler. And Churchill had spent years studying the dictator's nature. He reminded the cabinet that Hitler's previous agreements, with Austria, with Czechoslovakia, with Poland, had been broken almost instantly. Any promise Hitler made now would be a noose. Churchill described, in chilling detail, what negotiations would mean in practice. Internment of Jewish refugees in Britain, the dismantling of the Royal Navy, economic subservience to Berlin, and the inevitable transformation of Britain into a puppet state. The room chilled as he spoke. Churchill had a gift not merely for words, but for revealing stark truths others dared not imagine. Halifax's argument for negotiation seemed suddenly naive, an attempt to tame a wolf with diplomacy. In the midst of this political duel, Churchill also faced a military crisis of unprecedented scale. The British Expeditionary Force was racing toward the Channel ports, struggling to outpace the German encirclement. Communications were fractured, units scattered, generals improvising desperate withdrawals through collapsing front lines. Churchill received a frantic signal from General Gort. Unless British forces reached the coast swiftly, the entire army risked being cut off from the sea. The implications were staggering. If Britain lost its army, there would be no defense against invasion. Churchill grasped this instantly. He had no illusions. Without an army, Britain's resolve, however noble, would crumble. The BF must be saved. And to save it, Britain would need something close to a miracle. The cabinet discussions continued late into the night, each man bearing the fatigue of sleeplessness and the crushing weight of responsibility. At times, the silence in the room was more suffocating than the arguments. When Halifax grew frustrated, he appealed directly to Neville Chamberlain, whose loyalty still carried immense influence. Churchill watched this with anxiety hidden beneath steady composure. If Chamberlain sided with Halifax, Churchill's premiership could collapse after only a few days in office, opening the door to a government ready to negotiate surrender. But Chamberlain, humbled by the failure of appeasement, sensed that history had given him one last chance to stand firm. His quiet, reluctant support for Churchill began to harden. Churchill felt the shift like a subtle breeze changing direction. Meanwhile, outside Number 10, London lived in a suspended state of dread. Air raid sirens wailed unpredictably, sending citizens scurrying into shelters. Newspapers printed grim headlines with cautious phrasing, but the truth seeped through. Britain was facing the gravest crisis in its modern history. Yet even amid the fear, Churchill's emergence as Prime Minister sparked a strange undercurrent of resilience. People whispered that at last a fighter was in charge. Taxi drivers spoke his name with a confidence that contrasted sharply with the anxiety gripping the war cabinet. It was as if the public, sensing the government's divide, placed its spiritual bet on Churchill before the politicians dared to. What Churchill feared most, however, was not German invasion but British hesitation. He understood that nations did not fall because they were defeated, but because they believed they were defeated. And Halifax's logic, however reasoned, risked planting precisely that seed. Churchill saw this crisis as a test not simply of military strength, but of national character. To negotiate with Hitler would silence the British spirit before the enemy ever reached its shores. Late that night, as he returned to his study, he realized the battle for Britain had shifted from maps and troop movements to something far more intimate, persuading a handful of exhausted, frightened men that defiance, even against overwhelming odds, was the only path to salvation. The situation deteriorated with brutal speed as German forces surged toward the Channel, sealing off escape routes with ruthless efficiency. Within 48 hours, what had seemed a strategic withdrawal turned into a desperate race against encirclement. British units, exhausted and disoriented, retreated through ruined villages and burning forests, often cut off from headquarters and forced to navigate by instinct rather than orders. Dispatches arriving in London painted a picture of organized chaos, columns of troops marching through the night, ammunition dwindling, rations running out, roads clogged with refugees fleeing in the same direction as the armies meant to protect them. Churchill read these reports in the cabinet room, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. He understood that the fate of Britain's army, and thus the fate of Britain itself, was being decided not in London's corridors but on the muddy roads of northern France. It was during these grim hours that the port of Dunkirk emerged not as a destination of hope, but as the last refuge left. Maps in the War Office showed the pocket shrinking daily, squeezed from south and east with terrifying precision. The French army, shattered but still fighting, struggled to hold the line long enough to keep the corridor open. Churchill knew the odds were appalling. Dunkirk had none of the grand naval facilities required for mass evacuation. Its beaches were shallow, its harbor vulnerable, its approaches exposed. Yet there was no alternative. If the British Expeditionary Force could not reach those shores, it would be swallowed whole. In those moments, Churchill took a decision he would later describe as one of the most agonizing of his life: to prepare not merely a withdrawal, but the largest evacuation attempt in British military history. He understood the implications fully. To bring the army home would be a salvage operation, not a victory. But without the army there could be no Britain. In the War Cabinet, Halifax seized upon the military catastrophe as proof that negotiation was Britain's only realistic option. He argued that saving the army might still be possible if Britain sought mediation through Mussolini before the Germans tightened the noose. Churchill responded with controlled fury, insisting that approaching Mussolini would signal weakness, encourage Hitler, and demoralize the troops fighting for their lives. A nation, he argued, could not inspire its army to escape annihilation while simultaneously whispering surrender behind closed doors. Halifax countered with icy rationality: if the army were lost, Britain would be defenseless. Should not preservation of the nation take precedence over pride? The exchange was less a debate than a clash of incompatible philosophies. Halifax valued survival. Churchill valued dignity as the precondition for survival. Meanwhile, Churchill demanded ideas from the military staff, any strategy, however unconventional, that might keep the Germans at bay long enough for evacuation. Some generals proposed counterattacks. Others insisted they were impossible. A few suggested that the Royal Air Force could cripple German armor from above, but the air staff warned of heavy losses. Churchill listened to each with a strategic imagination that astonished his commanders. He was not a general, yet he possessed a rare ability to extract opportunity from disaster. He ordered the Admiralty to prepare every possible vessel: destroyers, troopships, fishing boats, tugs. In doing so, he set in motion the first threads of what would later become the legend of the little ships. But at this moment, it was no legend. It was a gamble of desperation, backed by calculation rather than hope. Amid these military preparations, Churchill remained acutely aware that his greatest challenge still lay within the cabinet. Halifax's arguments gained potency with every hour of bad news. Reports from France indicated that the German advance was accelerating, that French morale was breaking, and that Dunkirk might be surrounded within days. Halifax warned that Britain could not afford to hinge its national survival on a miracle. Chamberlain, still recovering from political humiliation yet clinging to his influence, oscillated between the two men, torn between Halifax's reasoned caution and Churchill's stubborn defiance. Churchill sensed the fragility of the moment. If Halifax turned Chamberlain firmly to his side, Churchill's premiership, barely a week old, could collapse, replaced by a government ready to negotiate with Hitler before the fighting even reached British soil. Publicly, Churchill projected absolute confidence, masking the turmoil behind closed doors. He addressed the nation in sober tones, acknowledging the grave military situation without revealing its full magnitude. His words were measured but resolute, crafted to steel the public's nerves. Britain would fight on. The army was brave. The French were still resisting. But even as he spoke, he knew how perilous the truth was. He had received reports of British battalions fighting with dwindling supplies, of commanders forced to abandon heavy equipment to move faster, of entire companies wiped out in rearguard actions. Yet he refused to allow the public to lose hope. Morale, he believed, was as vital a weapon as any aircraft or artillery battery. And morale began with leadership. In private moments, Churchill wrestled with decisions that seemed impossible. Should he commit more destroyers to the evacuation, knowing they might be lost and leave Britain vulnerable to invasion? Should he risk RAF squadrons over Dunkirk even if it meant weakening air defenses at home? Should he encourage the French to continue fighting, even as their government flirted with armistice? These were choices that balanced national survival against operational sacrifice. And yet, amid the pressure, Churchill found an anchor within himself. He believed profoundly that Britain must emerge from the crisis not only alive but unbroken. To save the army without saving the nation's will would be hollow. His mind returned repeatedly to the principle that had guided him through decades of political wilderness. Nations, like individuals, are defined less by their comforts than by their resistance to despair. By the end of that week, as retreat turned into entrapment, Churchill faced the cabinet once more. The room felt heavier, the air thicker, as though history itself was leaning over the table. The ministers awaited Churchill's words. He did not offer optimism. He did not offer false comfort. Instead, he declared that Britain would not negotiate, not now, not while its army still fought, not while France struggled, not while a single chance of resistance remained. He promised only struggle and sacrifice, yet in doing so he offered something far greater: purpose. It was a turning point, not because the cabinet was yet united, but because Churchill had drawn a line that could not be crossed without shattering Britain's spirit. In that moment, his resolve became the center of gravity around which the nation would soon rally. As May 1940 stretched into its most desperate phase, the internal battle within the British government intensified with a ferocity as dangerous as any threat from the Luftwaffe. The War Cabinet, now meeting several times each day, had become a crucible of fear, pride, and competing visions of the nation's future. The Peace Party, a term later whispered by historians but never spoken aloud in those rooms, coalesced around Halifax. These were not traitors or cowards. They were men shaped by the trauma of the Great War, men who could not imagine another generation being consumed in the furnace of continental destruction. Halifax represented their cautious realism, their belief that Britain must preserve itself, even at the cost of concession. Churchill, on the other hand, carried the opposite vision. Survival through defiance, strength through endurance, the idea that a nation could be broken only from within. The clash was not personal. It was existential. The pressure on Churchill became almost unbearable. The War Cabinet was split evenly, Churchill and Attlee on one side, Halifax and Chamberlain on the other, with Arthur Greenwood, Labour's deputy leader, hovering nervously between the two camps. Halifax sensed the moment of opportunity and pressed harder. He proposed a concrete plan. Britain should ask Mussolini, who had not yet entered the war, to mediate peace terms with Hitler. Halifax framed this as a diplomatic exploration, not a surrender. But Churchill saw the truth instantly. Once Britain opened such channels, it could never close them without appearing faithless or delusional. Hitler would sense panic and demand harsher terms. The United States would lose faith in Britain's resolve. The Dominions might break away. And most disastrously, the British people, still unaware of the true scale of the disaster in France, would lose the will to fight. Churchill listened to Halifax with a dangerous stillness, his cigar smoldering in silence. He did not interrupt. He did not shout. Instead, he waited until Halifax finished and then asked a single devastating question: "What terms exactly shall we request?" The room froze. Halifax, who had hoped to frame negotiation as a procedural step, now confronted the brutal reality of what he was proposing. Should Britain consider giving up the fleet? The Mediterranean? The right to govern its empire? The freedom of its parliament? Halifax avoided specifics, insisting that Mussolini could serve as an honest broker. Churchill countered that Mussolini was not a neutral figure but Hitler's ideological ally. Asking him to mediate was tantamount to inviting the wolf to guard the sheep. For days, this argument repeated itself in different forms, with each new military disaster adding fuel to Halifax's case. And military disaster was plentiful. The BEF was now confined to the shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk. German armor had reached the coast. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. French generals sent increasingly frantic reports describing units dissolving under pressure. The French government itself veered toward collapse, with some ministers urging surrender while others begged Britain to keep fighting. Halifax wielded these reports like weapons in debate. Churchill, meanwhile, used them as proof of how quickly things disintegrate once the first steps toward surrender are taken. The cabinet grew strained, exhausted, and dangerously close to fracture. Chamberlain's role became pivotal. Despite his political downfall, he remained leader of the Conservative Party and held immense sway among ministers. Churchill knew that if Chamberlain sided fully with Halifax, the government could be reshaped overnight, replacing Churchill with a figure more amenable to negotiation. Churchill thus deployed one of his most subtle and underestimated skills, the ability to appeal to the conscience of a man who had once been his adversary. He reminded Chamberlain, without cruelty, that appeasement had failed not because it was immoral, but because it misunderstood the enemy. "We cannot bargain with a tiger," Churchill said quietly, "when our heads are in its mouth." Something in Chamberlain shifted. His pride wounded but intact, he sensed the need for redemption. Slowly he began tilting toward Churchill, not out of belief in Churchill's methods, but out of recognition that Halifax's solution would destroy everything he had tried to preserve. Meanwhile, outside the cabinet's claustrophobic chambers, Churchill's instincts told him that the broader government, the nearly 30 ministers who made up the full cabinet, must be brought into the struggle. They were not told of the full scale of discussions, nor of Halifax's attempts to pursue peace channels. They assumed, as the country did, that Britain's position was desperate but not yet hopeless. Churchill made a bold calculation. If the War Cabinet's debates could not be resolved internally, he would expose the issue to the full cabinet and rely on the natural instinct of politicians who understood the public mood. For while Britain's military prospects were bleak, the nation's moral instinct was not. Churchill believed, almost mystically, that the British people would rather risk annihilation than submission. And he suspected the full cabinet would reflect that instinct. That moment came on May 28. After days of suffocating argument, Churchill entered the cabinet room during a brief recess and found several junior ministers gathered anxiously. Word of the Dunkirk disaster had begun to spread, though the details remained hazy. Churchill realized the time had come for a decisive move. He spoke with a force that shattered the building's tension. He told them plainly that some members of the War Cabinet were considering negotiations with Hitler. Gasps spread across the room. Churchill said that he, for one, would consider drowning in the Channel rather than surrender. Then he added something even more electrifying, an assertion that the public would never accept peace with tyranny while an ounce of strength remained. As he spoke, the ministers began to nod, then to murmur agreement, then to pound the table in approval. They declared unanimously that Britain must fight on. The impact of this thunderous reaction rippled instantly back into the War Cabinet. Halifax, realizing that the larger government would never support his proposal, recognized that his position had become politically untenable. Chamberlain, hearing the mood from those who attended, understood that Churchill now held the moral, if not yet the strategic, mandate of the nation. With the full cabinet's overwhelming support behind him, Churchill returned to the War Cabinet with renewed authority. Halifax, perceptive enough to understand politics, knew the tide had turned. Churchill had checked him, not by argument alone, but by appealing to the deeper instinct of a nation that refused to bow. The balance had shifted decisively. Churchill's gamble had worked. May 28, 1940, one of the most consequential days in British political history, began with Churchill rising before dawn, his sleep shattered by the weight of events pressing upon him. He was physically drained, mentally overstretched, yet emotionally resolute. He knew this day would determine not only the course of the war, but the fate of the British nation for centuries to come. If Halifax succeeded in forcing negotiations, Britain's story as an independent power would effectively end. If Churchill prevailed, the nation might face invasion, bombardment, starvation, yet preserve its soul. The stakes were so immense that Churchill later admitted he felt as though destiny itself had entered the cabinet room with them. As he buttoned his waistcoat, lit his first cigar, and walked down the narrow corridor toward the War Cabinet meeting, he sensed the day would test him as nothing ever had, not Gallipoli, not the trenches, not years of political exile. This was the fulcrum on which history turned. The War Cabinet meeting that morning was immediately tense. Halifax, unbowed by the previous night's debates, doubled down on his argument. The French government, he said, was nearing collapse. Belgium had capitulated. The British army was trapped. Mussolini was still neutral, still willing, potentially, to mediate. If Britain waited until the Germans tightened their grip, it would lose the ability to negotiate from any position other than abject surrender. Churchill countered with controlled ferocity. He argued that to open discussions now would be to reveal weakness so deep that it might shatter the nation before a single German soldier set foot on British soil. And he repeated his most potent point. Hitler could not be trusted to negotiate in good faith. Every treaty he had ever signed had become a prelude to aggression. To rely on him for Britain's salvation was to place the nation's fate in the hands of a man for whom deceit was a governing principle. The argument spiraled into one of the most intense exchanges in British political memory. Halifax, losing patience, accused Churchill of gambling recklessly with the future of the empire. Churchill, maintaining an icy dignity, replied that the empire's future meant nothing if it ceased to be free. What Halifax did not fully grasp, but Churchill did, was that Britain's power derived not from territory but from moral authority. If Britain capitulated while resisting forces still fought, it would become irrelevant to every nation it once inspired. At one point, Halifax leaned forward and said sharply that refusing to explore peace terms might be, to imperil the nation beyond recovery. Churchill answered with a calmness that struck the room like a hammer. The nation's recovery would be impossible only if its leaders surrendered its honor. For a moment, even Halifax fell silent. But the turning point of the day occurred not in the War Cabinet, but in the larger meeting Churchill had engineered with the full cabinet. When the ministers filed into the cabinet room, they did so with anxious faces, expecting grim military briefings. Instead, Churchill gave them something far more shocking: the truth of the political struggle they had not been told about. He explained that some members of the War Cabinet were considering negotiations with Hitler. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Many paled. Others stiffened with disbelief. Some had lost sons in the First War. Others had watched Europe fall piece by piece in the Second. The idea that Britain, might now beg Hitler for terms was unbearable. Churchill, sensing the swell of emotion, unleashed one of the most electrifying speeches of his life. He did not offer grand rhetoric, he offered raw defiance. He said Britain would fight on even if the army were lost, even if invasion came, even if the government had to retreat to Scotland or Canada. He said he would not lead a government that submitted to tyranny. The room erupted, not with applause but with a tidal wave of agreement. Ministers pounded the table, stood up, shouted support. It was not the orchestrated approval of political loyalty. It was the spontaneous roar of a government discovering its own courage. The emotion was overwhelming, almost primal. Many later said that this was the moment they realized Britain would never surrender, not because of Churchill alone, but because they themselves would not permit it. Churchill left the room knowing he had won something more valuable than a political victory. He had awakened a collective will. And that will would become the backbone of Britain's war effort. The ministers, returning to their departments, passed this resolve to their staffs. The staffs passed it to their subordinates. And within hours, a shift rippled through Whitehall. A decision had been made, unspoken but unmistakable: Britain would fight. The impact of this moment on the formal War Cabinet was immediate and profound. When Churchill re-entered its smaller, claustrophobic chamber, Halifax and Chamberlain could sense the change. Churchill now carried the authority of the entire government behind him, an authority Halifax could not counter without igniting political rebellion across the ministries. Halifax attempted one final argument, suggesting that the cabinet must still consider diplomatic options. But his words floated weakly in the air, bereft of momentum. Even Chamberlain, who had once been Halifax's strongest ally, now nodded gravely toward Churchill's position. The internal balance of power had shifted. Halifax, recognizing that his stance had become politically untenable, retreated with silent dignity. The peace initiative collapsed, not through prime ministerial decree, but through the overwhelming instinct of a nation refusing to kneel. As the day ended, Churchill returned to his study with a heaviness in his limbs but a fire in his spirit. He poured a small glass of brandy, set his cigar alight, and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He knew that Britain's prospects were still dire. The army remained trapped, France teetered, invasion threatened. Yet something fundamental had changed. Britain had chosen its path, not the path of safety but the path of honor. Churchill would later describe this day as the moment he felt sure we should not fail. Not because victory was likely, it was not, but because the nation now possessed something more important than probability: resolve. This was the day Britain decided to fight whatever the cost. And from that decision flowed everything else: the evacuation at Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, the endurance of the Blitz, and ultimately, the survival of Western civilization. Late that night, as he prepared to sleep, Churchill whispered a quiet acknowledgement to himself. The victory was not final, and the struggle ahead would be vast. But Britain had crossed a threshold. The government had chosen courage. The people would soon echo it. And in that unity of will, he sensed the faint heartbeat of future triumph, distant, uncertain, but alive. As Britain's political crisis settled, if only for a moment, the military disaster across the Channel intensified to its breaking point. By May 29, the Dunkirk pocket had contracted into a thin crescent of battered land and burning towns. German artillery pounded the perimeter relentlessly, the thunder of shells echoing across the beaches like the drumbeats of doom. British and French soldiers, soot-blackened and starved, dug makeshift trenches in the dunes, bracing for an attack they believed would come at any moment. Many units had lost their officers. Some companies were down to a handful of survivors. Yet despite the chaos, the perimeter held, barely. What the troops did not yet know was that behind the scenes, Churchill had already committed nearly every seaworthy vessel in Britain to a desperate rescue. The operation, codenamed Dynamo, had begun. And though Churchill hoped for 20 or 30,000 men to be saved, he feared even that might be optimistic. The Admiralty worked at a pace bordering on frenzy. The tunnels beneath Dover Castle, hidden from the world, became the nerve center of the evacuation. Officers shouted orders over clattering telephones, tracing the labyrinth of sandbanks and shoals that made Dunkirk's approach treacherous even in peacetime. Destroyers were dispatched despite the risk of Luftwaffe air attacks. Minesweepers cleared paths under fire. Yet the port itself was already devastated by German bombs. Harbor walls shattered, piers aflame, channel markers ripped away. The evacuation had to be improvised through a single surviving mole, a narrow concrete pier never intended for mass boarding. Soldiers lined the length of it for hours, their boots sliding on debris, as naval crews shepherded them into waiting ships under continuous bombardment. The entire effort teetered between order and catastrophe. And still, somehow, it continued. Yet what transformed the evacuation from a perilous naval mission into a historic salvation was the mobilization of civilian courage. The Ministry of Shipping issued a call for small craft, pleasure boats, fishing smacks, river barges, tugboats, coasters, lifeboats, anything that could traverse the channel and reach men stranded in shallow waters. Families watched in awe as dozens of vessels, many piloted by ordinary fishermen or weekend sailors, set off toward the smoke-filled horizon. Some had little wireless equipment. Others had no defensive armaments at all. Yet they departed with a quiet determination born of instinct rather than orders. This was not romance or later myth. It was a movement born from necessity. And Churchill, though he never intended this mass mobilization to become a symbol, understood instantly that it would. For the British people, the evacuation was no longer merely military, it was personal. The RAF fought fiercely above the beaches, though their contribution was often unseen by the soldiers below. Dogfights erupted miles inland, where Spitfires and Hurricanes intercepted German bombers before they reached the beaches. Many British soldiers, seeing few aircraft overhead, cursed the RAF out of frustration. But Churchill received the air statistics daily. Squadrons were taking heavy losses, yet preventing even heavier casualties on the ground. Still, the strain on fighter command was immense. Churchill faced a terrible dilemma: whether to continue committing fighter squadrons to Dunkirk or conserve them for the expected battle over Britain's skies. If he weakened air defense at home, Britain might win the evacuation but lose the island. But if he held the aircraft back, the army might die on the beaches. It was a decision of impossible stakes, and Churchill made it hour by hour, weighing every squadron as though weighing the nation's breath. Throughout these days, Churchill lived in a state of controlled turmoil. He moved constantly between the cabinet room, the Admiralty, and the underground war rooms, receiving updates that swung wildly between hope and despair. One hour, a destroyer arrived with thousands of rescued soldiers. The next, another destroyer was sunk with all hands. Churchill refused to allow either triumph or tragedy to govern his judgment. He scrutinized tidal charts, weather forecasts, Luftwaffe sortie patterns. He demanded reports from commanders on both sides of the channel, piecing together a mosaic of chaos. And yet, even as he managed the practicalities, he felt a deeper urgency. The rescue of the army was not merely a tactical necessity, it was the moral foundation for the fight ahead. Without an army, Britain could not defend its shores. Without a rescue, Britain could not defend its spirit. On the night of May 30th, Churchill visited the Admiralty again and stood silently before the massive map of northern France. A young officer pinned new markers to represent rescued troops. Churchill watched the numbers rise, 18,000, 32,000, 40,000. It was astonishing, almost unbelievable. But he refused to indulge in premature relief. The bulk of the army remained trapped and the Germans were closing in. He issued firm orders to continue the evacuation, to the last man. Admirals protested that the fleet could not sustain such losses. Churchill ignored them. He sensed that history had opened a narrow corridor through which Britain's hopes must pass. If they failed to seize this moment, there would be no second chance. As he left the Admiralty, clerks noticed his gait, exhausted, yes, but unyielding. The next day brought a rare burst of good fortune. 4 reasons still debated: logistical confusion, exhaustion, tactical misjudgment. German high command slowed its advance toward the Dunkirk perimeter. Churchill received the news with a mix of relief and suspicion. He knew the Germans would resume assault soon, but even a temporary reprieve was invaluable. The evacuation surged in pace. Lines of men waded into the surf, rifles held above water, waiting to climb aboard small craft that ferried them to larger ships offshore. Sea spray mixed with smoke, sand with blood. This was not a triumphant withdrawal, it was an ordeal, a test of endurance and will. And yet, hour by hour, the miracle unfolded. Men who had expected to die now tasted the salt air of homeward journeys. By June 1st, as the operation neared its peak, Churchill realized something extraordinary. The evacuation was becoming more than a military salvage. It was becoming a national legend in real time. Though the full story had yet to reach the public, he sensed the narrative forming, the image of soldiers rescued from death, of civilians crossing the channel under fire, of a nation refusing to accept defeat. He knew that such stories would shape morale more deeply than any speech or statistic. And when the final tallies began to emerge, hundreds of thousands rescued, Churchill understood that the nation's future had been altered. Britain would fight on not because it was strong but because it had refused to break. As Operation Dynamo reached its terrifying crescendo, Churchill prepared for one of the most consequential speeches of his career. By June 3, the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force had escaped the tightening German ring. Yet Churchill refused to call it a victory. He knew that a rescued army without weapons, vehicles, or heavy equipment was an army only in name. Britain now stood almost alone, with only skeleton defenses between its shores and Hitler's advancing war machine. Still, the evacuation had produced something he valued even more than divisions or battalions: a surge of national morale. Churchill sensed it in the way ministers spoke to him, in the tone of military dispatches, even in the expressions of clerks hurrying through Downing Street. The country, battered and breathless, had discovered within itself a force no invasion could extinguish. His speech to Parliament would need to capture that force, without deceiving the nation about the magnitude of the peril ahead. The cabinet met early that morning, their faces lined with exhaustion. Reports from Dunkirk indicated that the last groups of soldiers were being evacuated under hellish fire. Entire formations had been reduced to ragged remnants. The French army, still fighting desperately to cover the final withdrawals, begged Britain to continue committing ships. Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to stay until the final feasible moment. Admirals protested again, citing mines, submarines, and the near-total depletion of British destroyers, but Churchill would not bend. A handful more hours might save thousands of men. And those thousands would become the nucleus of Britain's future defense. Even as the cabinet absorbed the grim facts, Churchill's mind had already leapt ahead to the speech he would deliver that afternoon. He needed to tell the truth, but with a tone that would prevent despair. His instinct told him to speak not as a general or a politician, but as a guardian of the nation's spirit. By noon, Churchill stood in his small study, dictating the final passages of the speech to his secretary, who struggled to keep pace with the torrent of words. He spoke of deliverance rather than triumph, naming the evacuation for what it truly was, a rescue accomplished through sacrifice and blood. He refused to allow the public to imagine that Dunkirk had somehow reversed the course of the war. In fact, he inserted a sentence that startled even his close staff: "Wars are not won by evacuations." It was a reminder that danger, not safety, defined the days ahead. Yet Churchill had no intention of dampening the spirit surging across the country. And so he crafted a conclusion that would enter the bloodstream of British identity, lines not meant for Parliament alone, but for every household preparing for a battle that would soon unfold over their own rooftops. When Churchill arrived in the House of Commons that afternoon, the chamber crackled with anticipation. Word of the massive evacuation had spread, though the exact numbers were still concealed for security reasons. Members of Parliament leaned forward on their benches, aware that they were about to hear the Prime Minister's verdict on the greatest retreat in British military history. Churchill began slowly, methodically, recounting the events of the previous week without embellishment. He described the collapse in Belgium, the German breakthrough, the shrinking perimeter, all the brutal details that had led to the necessity of evacuation. He did not spare the House the harsh truth. Tens of thousands had been killed or taken prisoner, and virtually all heavy equipment had been abandoned. But as he spoke, his voice gathered force, rising with the same rhythm the nation itself had discovered in these dark days. Then came the pivot. Churchill described the evacuation as a miracle of deliverance, praising the Navy, the Air Force, the soldiers and the civilian sailors whose courage had stunned the world. Yet even in this praise he refused sentimentality. He knew the real test still lay ahead. And so, after a measured pause, he turned to the future, not with fear but with fierce determination. The rhetoric shifted, the chamber tensed, and Churchill began the passage that would define not only his leadership but the nation's soul. Britain would defend its island, its land, its seas, and its people. He invoked beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, and hills, each phrase expanding the circle of national defense until it encompassed the entire British landscape. The words were not mere poetry, they were geography transformed into resolve. The House erupted in awe. Members who had doubted him now felt the gravity of his conviction. Even those who had considered Halifax's proposals days earlier sensed the futility of negotiation in the face of such unity. Churchill's peroration did not promise victory. It promised defiance. And it implied, between the lines, a truth that electrified the chamber. No matter what the enemy brought, the British people would refuse to yield. As he sat down, the reaction was not applause, parliamentary tradition forbade it, but stunned silence, the kind that precedes a collective understanding that history has just shifted. Members later recalled that some felt physically altered by the speech, as if Churchill had taken their fear and reshaped it into something stronger. Yet Churchill himself felt no triumph. As he walked out of the chamber and into the brighter light of the lobby, he knew the speech had bought Britain time, but not safety. The enemy was gathering strength across the Channel. The Luftwaffe prepared for an assault that would test every pilot and fighter command. Hitler's generals spoke openly of invasion schedules. And France, valiant, wounded France, teetered on the edge of collapse. Churchill understood that when France fell, the storm would break upon Britain with full force. The speech had fortified the nation's morale, but courage could not shoot down aircraft or sink battleships. For that, he needed time, and time was the rarest resource. Late that night, Churchill received final reports confirming that over 330,000 men had been rescued from Dunkirk. He sat alone in his study, the numbers swimming in his vision. Against all odds, Britain had saved its army. But the cost had been nearly everything else: guns, tanks, vehicles, supplies. He knew that the coming battle would be the most dangerous Britain had ever faced. Yet for the first time since becoming Prime Minister, he felt something more than resolve. He felt hope, not hope for victory, but hope that the nation would now stand with him in whatever darkness lay ahead. The miracle of Dunkirk had given Britain back its army. His speech had given Britain back its voice. Now the fight for the island could begin. The days following the Dunkirk evacuation brought not relief but an escalating sense of dread. France, whose armies had once been considered among the strongest in Europe, now buckled under the relentless weight of the German advance. Town after town fell with numbing speed, Amiens, Rouen, Reims, each loss collapsing another pillar of French resistance. Churchill, receiving the updates in the war rooms, felt the inevitability pressing upon him. He knew that if France surrendered, Britain would become the last bastion of democracy in a continent swallowed by authoritarian darkness. He also understood the psychological catastrophe such an event would inflict on the British public, who still clung to the hope that France might recover. Yet Churchill felt compelled to face this reality head-on. He had no patience for false optimism. France was dying and Britain must prepare for isolation. On June 10, Churchill flew once more to France, this time to Briare, to meet the French cabinet. The journey was tense, the skies filled with smoke drifting from burning villages below. When he arrived, the atmosphere was grim. French ministers sat pale and hollow-eyed around the long table, the weight of imminent collapse etched on their faces. General Vagon insisted that the French army had been pushed beyond its limits. Prime Minister Reynaud pleaded for British air support and more troops, but Churchill knew he could provide neither. To strip Britain's defences now, with invasion looming, would be suicidal. The French asked what Britain intended to do if they fell. Churchill replied simply and with quiet conviction, Britain would fight on alone. The French stared at him, some with admiration, others with disbelief. To them, continued resistance seemed futile. To Churchill, surrender was unthinkable. The meeting deteriorated quickly. Some French ministers began advocating for an armistice, arguing that France had lost the ability to protect its civilians. Arguments erupted across the table, blunt, desperate, and scattered. Churchill tried to rally them, insisting that France could fight on from its colonies in North Africa. But he saw the defeat in their eyes. Our front is broken, one minister whispered. France bleeds to death. Churchill left the meeting with a heavy heart, feeling as though he had just witnessed the last breath of an old friend. As his aircraft lifted off toward England, he looked down at the countryside he had cherished since youth. Smoke rose from dozens of fires, like funeral pyres marking the end of an era. He knew that within hours, France would make a decision that would change the world. Back in Downing Street, Churchill prepared the cabinet for the inevitable. Reports confirmed that the French government was splitting, some urging surrender, others contemplating flight to North Africa. Worst of all, communications collapsed across the French command structure, making coordinated defense impossible. The war cabinet grew tense. Some ministers feared that French surrender would free vast German divisions for an invasion of Britain. Churchill agreed, but he would not allow fear to dominate the conversation. Instead, he articulated the cold, urgent truth. If Britain faltered now, if they permitted even a whisper of defeatism to creep in, Hitler would pounce with the ferocity of a predator sensing weakness. The cabinet listened in near silence, the weight of his words sinking deeply. They had already decided Britain would fight. Now they understood the magnitude of what that decision entailed. On June 14, Paris fell. The City of Light, the symbol of European civilization, surrendered without a final battle. German troops marched through silent streets as the French flag was lowered from government buildings. Churchill received the news during a brief break in a cabinet session. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in despair but in mourning. He remembered walking through Paris as a young man, intoxicated by its beauty. Now it was occupied and Europe seemed to exhale one long, hopeless breath. Yet Churchill refused to allow the tragedy to overshadow Britain's resolve. He walked back into the cabinet room, face stern but controlled, and announced simply, "Gentlemen, Paris has fallen." A hush fell. Someone muttered, "What hope remains?" Churchill answered with a voice like a drawn sword, "Hope, gentlemen, lies in ourselves." France continued its descent toward surrender. Reynaud, desperate to avoid capitulation, resigned when his cabinet refused to continue the fight. Marshal Pétain, revered as the hero of Verdun but now aged and pessimistic, took power and immediately signaled his intention to seek an armistice. Churchill recognized the moment's gravity. France's surrender would leave Britain alone not just militarily but morally. Civilization now depended on one island, and one decision. He convened the war cabinet again, stating bluntly that Pétain's choice would bring enormous danger but no change in British policy. "We shall fight on," he declared. Halifax, who had argued so strongly for negotiation days earlier, remained silent. He had lost the argument. Churchill now commanded a united cabinet, but unity did not lessen the peril. On June 17, Pétain announced over French radio that he was seeking peace. Churchill listened to the broadcast from his study, head lowered. The words were like a verdict. France, the great ally of 1914, the shield of Western Europe, had fallen. Churchill felt the sorrow but he would not allow it to take root. As he stood, it was as though he shed the grief like a weight too costly to carry. Britain must now transform itself from a nation at war into a fortress of resistance. He walked to the cabinet room with a new clarity forming inside him, one born not of hope but of necessity. Britain's survival would depend on its ability to endure isolation, withstand air attack, and maintain faith in itself despite every sign of hopelessness. That evening, Churchill addressed the nation by radio. His tone was grave but galvanizing. He spoke of France's agony, of Britain's sorrow, but also of Britain's unshakable determination to continue the struggle. "The Battle of France is over," he said with solemn weight. "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin." These words, though now famous, were not intended as prophecy. They were a warning, a preparation, and a summons. Churchill wanted every citizen, every soldier, every child in Britain to understand what was coming. A storm unlike anything the island had ever endured. And yet he offered not fear but resolve. If the Germans were preparing to invade, then Britain must be prepared to repel them. If the Luftwaffe sought to break the nation's spirit, then the spirit must harden. As he finished the broadcast and stepped away from the microphone, Churchill felt a stillness settle around him, the stillness that sometimes precedes a great tempest. Britain was alone now, truly alone. But for the first time he sensed that the nation understood its role not as a victim of history, but as its defender. The battle to save civilization had passed fully into their hands. And they would be ready. With France defeated and the last echoes of its surrender fading across Europe, Britain braced itself for an onslaught unprecedented in its long history. German commanders began openly discussing Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, as the next unavoidable step toward total domination. Churchill, informed through intelligence intercepts and diplomatic channels, felt the pressure tightening around the island like a noose. Yet rather than succumb to fear, he transformed the nation's peril into purpose. He ordered the home forces to prepare the coastline for invasion, knowing full well that the beaches, cliffs and coves of Britain would soon become battlegrounds if Hitler gained command of the air. Everywhere he looked, Churchill saw vulnerability, but also potential. Every cottage, church, meadow and country road could be weaponized. If Germany wanted Britain, it would have to bleed for every inch. The transformation of the countryside began immediately. Units of the regular army repositioned themselves along potential landing zones. The Auxiliary Territorial Service expanded to support logistics, communications and planning. And perhaps most significantly, Churchill energized the formation of the Home Guard, ordinary citizens who just weeks earlier had been shopkeepers, teachers, fishermen and factory workers. Now they stepped forward as defenders of the realm. Equipped at first with little more than rudimentary rifles, improvised weapons and raw determination, they trained in village greens, on farms and beside railway stations. Churchill understood their symbolic power. When millions of citizens willingly prepared to fight house by house, field by field, it sent a message to Hitler that Britain would not collapse like the nations that had fallen before it. Churchill later remarked that the sight of elderly men drilling with broomsticks, waiting for rifles, stirred him more deeply than many battlefield reports. Yet the real shield against invasion lay not on the ground but in the air. Churchill had already concluded that the only way to prevent Operation Sea Lion from becoming reality was to deny the Luftwaffe the control it sought over British skies. Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, was the cornerstone of this strategy. Dowding's network of radar stations, operations rooms, sector commands, and meticulously organized squadrons formed the most advanced air defense system in the world. But it was fragile. Losses at Dunkirk had cost Fighter Command dozens of valuable aircraft, and the pilots, those young men Churchill would soon call the few, were far too scarce. Still, Dowding insisted on training standards that many politicians deemed excessive. He refused to rush half-prepared pilots into battle, arguing that experience, not numbers, would win the coming struggle. Churchill privately admired Dowding's stubbornness. He recognized in him a reflection of his own resolve. Britain's industrial centers shifted to a wartime rhythm that accelerated with each passing day. The aircraft factories of the Midlands worked around the clock, producing Hurricanes and Spitfires with a sense of urgency unmatched in peacetime industry. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, riveting fuselages, assembling engines and testing components with meticulous care. Churchill visited one such factory in early July and walked among the workers, many of whom labored 12-hour shifts under sweltering conditions. He shook hands, offered encouragement, and told them candidly that their work mattered as much as any soldiers. What he did not say, but felt inwardly, was that the survival of Britain might well hinge on the speed at which these factories could replace lost aircraft. Every plane constructed meant one more fighter to meet the Luftwaffe in the coming storm. Civil defense preparations expanded rapidly. Cities set up sandbags, fire breaks and shelters. The blackout, designed to hinder German bombers searching for targets, became a nightly ritual, turning towns into silhouettes against the sea. Air raid wardens patrolled with whistles and torches, enforcing rules designed to save lives. Anti-aircraft batteries appeared in parks, on rooftops and in open fields, their barrels pointed skyward in grim anticipation. Churchill studied these preparations closely. He knew they were essential not just for physical protection but for morale. A population that felt prepared would not panic. A population that believed in its resilience would endure the worst the enemy could bring. The Prime Minister visited shelters, spoke with families, encouraged children, and reminded everyone he met that Britain's fight was not just military, it was civilizational. Simultaneously, Churchill worked tirelessly to strengthen alliances, even as the map of Europe shrank under Nazi domination. He pleaded with the United States for increased support, navigating the complex politics of American neutrality. Franklin Roosevelt, sympathetic but constrained, expanded aid through creative legal interpretations, allowing the shipment of rifles, machine guns, ammunition, and eventually aircraft. It was not enough to alter the immediate odds, but it provided a lifeline. Churchill sensed the significance of this transatlantic connection and believed that if Britain could endure long enough, American support might transform the war. For now, however, Britain remained the only active defender against Hitler's ambitions. Churchill carried this burden every hour of every day. In private moments, Churchill grappled with the magnitude of what lay ahead. He understood that Hitler expected Britain to sue for peace, believing the island's resolve would crumble under bombardment. Churchill knew the opposite must occur. If Britain showed even a flicker of hesitation, Germany would exploit it mercilessly. And so he steeled himself, cultivating a public persona of unwavering certainty. But behind closed doors he wrestled with the logistics of survival: fuel shortages, aircraft losses, the possibility of invasion. He studied tide tables and beach gradients, estimating where German divisions might land. He read intelligence summaries obsessively, searching for clues about German intentions. He slept little, sometimes only an hour or two, driven by a sense that every waking moment was necessary for Britain's salvation. By mid-July, British preparations had reached their peak. The Home Guard numbered more than 1 million volunteers. Coastal defenses formed a patchwork of pillboxes, trenches, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles stretching from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands. Fighter Command awaited the first major Luftwaffe assault, its pilots tense but ready. Churchill sensed that the confrontation he had foretold, the Battle of Britain, was imminent. He walked through Fighter Command's underground headquarters at Uxbridge, observing the giant plotting table where WAFs moved markers representing aircraft across a massive map. He watched in silence, absorbing the scale of the coming conflict. Every marker represented a life. Every shift in the pattern represented the fate of the nation. On the evening of July 19, Churchill stood alone at the window of number 10, looking out over a darkened London. The city lay silent beneath the blackout, a sleeping fortress awaiting its trial. Churchill felt the weight of history pressing upon him, heavier than ever before. The fall of France had marked the end of one world. The battle for Britain would determine whether another world, free, democratic, human, could survive. He lit a cigar, inhaled deeply, and whispered words only he could hear: "Let it come." The greatest air battle in history was about to begin. The first phase of the Battle of Britain opened not with a single dramatic blow, but with a steady escalation that tested the nation's nerves. In early July, the Luftwaffe conducted probing raids along the southern coast, targeting shipping convoys and coastal installations. These attacks, though limited, revealed the scale of what was coming. Waves of German bombers escorted by formidable Messerschmitt fighters, probing for weaknesses in Britain's defenses. Churchill received reports of these engagements with meticulous attention, studying the rhythms of German activity. He understood that Hitler's plan required nothing less than aerial domination. If the enemy failed to break Fighter Command, Operation Sea Lion would be impossible. Britain's fate now rested in the hands of a few thousand pilots, controllers, ground crews, and radar operators. A fragile human chain stretched across the nation. Radar, the unsung hero of Britain's air defense system, became the backbone of Dowding's strategy. Across the coast, tall lattice towers emitted signals that bounced off approaching aircraft, allowing controllers to detect German formations long before they crossed the channel. Churchill visited one radar station at Dover early in the battle. He watched as operators traced incoming blips, minute signals that represented hundreds of lives in the entire course of the war. The technology was revolutionary, but more remarkable still was the efficiency with which the system connected to Fighter Command headquarters. When radar stations reported incoming raids, information flowed instantly into sector operations rooms, where WAF plotters updated massive maps with colored markers. From these rooms, commanders scrambled squadrons with precision calculated down to minutes and miles. By late July, the Luftwaffe intensified its operations. German reconnaissance confirmed the structure of British defenses, and Göring, supremely confident, prepared to unleash the full might of his air arm. Churchill knew the deluge was coming. Every day he received reports of pilots killed in action, aircraft lost, airfields damaged. Yet the numbers remained manageable, the system intact. Still, the emotional toll on the pilots was immense. Many flew 3 or 4 sorties a day, battling exhaustion, grief, and terror. The average age of a fighter pilot was just 20. Churchill felt a paternal protectiveness toward them. When he visited airfields, he walked among the young men with a kind of reverent sorrow, sensing how many would not live to see the war's end. Yet they stood straight, joked with him, and saluted with pride. Their courage strengthened him more than any military statistic. Then came August 13th, Adler Tag Eagle Day, the moment when Hitler sought to crush fighter command in a decisive blow. Before dawn, the Luftwaffe launched massive attacks aimed at airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Waves of Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt fighters crossed the channel in tight formations. Churchill, in the underground war rooms, followed the battle through teleprinter reports and telephone lines. The tension was palpable. German aircraft hammered coastal airfields, destroying hangars, cratering runways, and killing ground crews. But British radar remained operational, and fighter command responded with disciplined ferocity. Hurricanes engaged the bombers while Spitfires tangled with the escorting fighters. The skies above Kent and Sussex filled with contrails, smoke, and falling wreckage. By nightfall, the Luftwaffe had inflicted damage, but not delivered the knockout blow it expected. In the days following Eagle Day, the battle intensified into a brutal rhythm. German bombers targeted sector airfields, attempting to break the command structure. Fighter command's pilots flew so frequently that some barely had time to eat between sorties. They slept in flight gear, collapsed on wooden chairs, or stretched out on the grass beside their aircraft. Ground crews worked miracles, repairing fighters in minutes that should have required hours. Churchill visited fighter command headquarters at Uxbridge during one of the battle's fiercest days, watching the ebb and flow of aerial conflict on the plotting table. At one point, nearly all available squadrons were engaged. The room was silent except for the rustle of maps and the clipped voices of controllers. When the raid finally broke, Dowding turned to Churchill and said quietly, "We are stretched thin, Prime Minister." Churchill nodded. He knew it. But he also knew something the Luftwaffe did not. Britain's system, though strained, had not collapsed. The Germans shifted tactics repeatedly. They attacked radar stations, only to find them repaired within hours. They focused on airfields, only to encounter dispersed squadrons taking off from grass strips and hidden taxiways. They tried baiting British fighters into traps with feint raids, but controllers resisted the temptation. Churchill admired Dowding's steady discipline, though many politicians and generals questioned his conservative use of reserves. Churchill resisted calls to interfere. He sensed that Dowding understood the battle's logic in a way others did not. To Churchill, these moments echoed his own earlier battles against political impatience. Holding the line required not just bravery but restraint. August bled into September and still Britain stood. Losses were heavy. Entire squadrons were reduced to a handful of men. Some pilots died on their first mission. Others survived dozens of sorties only to be shot down in routine patrols. Churchill read their casualty lists with a solemnity that bordered on grief. He knew that every one of them mattered not just tactically but symbolically. Their struggle embodied the nation's fate. In a private moment, he confessed to General Ismay, "All our hearts go out to these young men." But the public saw only the resolve in his speeches. Churchill refused to let despair seep into the national consciousness. The island must believe it could win. By early September, the Luftwaffe reached a critical crossroads. Failing to break fighter command, German strategy shifted again, this time toward the city of London. Churchill sensed the turning point even before the intelligence confirmed it. The battle for the skies had not been won, but Germany's focus was shifting away from the one target that truly mattered. Britain, fragile and battered, now stood at the threshold of survival. And Churchill understood that this shift, a mistake born of overconfidence, might prove the very misstep that would save the nation. The Luftwaffe's shift in strategy came swiftly and with ferocious clarity. On September 7, 1940, the first great daylight raid on London thundered across the Channel. More than 300 German bombers, escorted by nearly 600 fighters, swept over the Thames estuary in tight formation. Churchill, alerted in the war rooms, rushed to the roof of the Air Ministry as the sky above London filled with smoke trails, flames, and the distant rumble of explosions. He watched in grim silence as the city, a city he loved with a fierce, almost spiritual devotion, became the newest battlefield of the war. Docklands burned first, erupting into towering pillars of fire as warehouses, refineries, and shipping yards exploded. Thousands of civilians fled through streets choked with smoke. Yet even as the flames rose, the resolve of Londoners hardened. Churchill sensed immediately that the German High Command had made a grave mistake. By turning the war into an attack on civilians, Hitler hoped to break Britain's morale. Instead, he had ignited the very spirit he sought to crush. Nightfall brought horrors that no air raid in history had yet delivered. The Luftwaffe returned under cover of darkness, unleashing one of the most devastating bombings London would ever endure. Incendiaries rained down in vast clusters, turning entire neighborhoods into infernos. High-explosive bombs shattered water mains, making firefighting nearly impossible. Streets buckled, buildings collapsed, and thousands sought refuge in tube stations, their faces gray with dust and fear. Churchill visited some of these shelters that same night, walking among mothers holding infants, elderly men wrapped in blankets and children sleeping on benches. Yet he found not despair but a quiet, stubborn courage. People smiled at him, shook his hand and told him to give them back what they're giving us. The resilience humbled him. In their endurance, he recognized the spirit that would define Britain's wartime identity. Over the following nights, London burned again and again. The Luftwaffe struck the East End repeatedly, devastating entire districts that lacked the grand symbols of Westminster or the city. Churchill noticed with particular sorrow how the working-class neighborhoods bore the brunt of the raids. He insisted on visiting the worst-hit areas, often over the objections of his security team. Walking through smoldering ruins, he saw the wreckage of homes, the shattered remains of teacups on mantelpieces, the twisted frames of children's bicycles lying in the street. These images cut deeply into him, not simply as Prime Minister but as a man who believed profoundly in the dignity of ordinary people. Churchill knelt beside survivors, held their hands, offered words of comfort. He vowed silently that their suffering would never be forgotten, and that every bomb dropped on Britain hardened his determination not to yield. Still, the damage was immense. Over the next weeks, Germany expanded the bombing campaign to cities across the nation: Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, Coventry, Plymouth, and more. The intent was clear: destroy industry, cripple infrastructure, and shatter morale. Firestorms lit the night skies from coast to coast. Yet Churchill noticed a remarkable pattern emerging from the devastation. The more the Luftwaffe bombed, the more resolute the British people became. Factories destroyed one night reopened in makeshift form the next morning. Rail workers repaired tracks under moonlight. Women pushed rubble aside to reopen shops by dawn. Even government ministries refused to cease operations. Churchill believed that the Blitz, catastrophic as it was, revealed something profound. Britain had become a nation united not by fear but by defiance. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force continued its relentless defense of the skies. Though the Luftwaffe had shifted its focus to cities, fighter command remained critical. German bombers still required escorts, and British fighters harassed them at every opportunity. Churchill received daily reports of casualties: pilots shot down in flames, others narrowly escaping death by parachuting into fields or rivers. Yet the RAF's losses, though painful, no longer outpaced its ability to recover. Aircraft production surged, and pilots from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe joined the fight. Poles, Czechs, Canadians, New Zealanders, and others flew with extraordinary skill and fury. Churchill praised them publicly and privately, recognizing that their contributions were vital not just strategically but symbolically. Britain was no longer fighting alone. It had become the rallying point for free peoples everywhere. As September turned to October, the Luftwaffe intensified its night bombing campaign. London endured 57 consecutive nights of raids. The psychological strain became immense. Sleepless families huddled in shelters, emerging each morning to streets unrecognizable from the day before. Churchill, aware that morale was the decisive battleground, refused to let despair take root. He visited bomb sites at dawn, speaking with firefighters, rescue workers, and survivors. He praised the first responders, whom he called the heroes of the axe and hose, men and women who braved collapsing buildings and raging flames to save lives. Their valor became emblematic of Britain's resistance. Churchill later said that watching these rescue crews convinced him that no bombing campaign, no matter how intense, could break the spirit of a nation so willing to risk everything for its fellow citizens. Even as the bombs fell, Britain prepared for the future. Churchill pushed for expanded civil defense measures, improved shelter systems, and increased anti-aircraft defenses. He also compelled the War Cabinet to confront the grim possibility of mass casualties, drafting plans for evacuation, medical support, and emergency governance. Yet he refused to let logistical planning overshadow the nation's emotional resilience. In speeches broadcast across the country, he framed the struggle not as a brutal punishment but as a testament to British endurance. He reminded citizens that the enemy sought to break their will, and that their refusal to bend was the greatest victory they could achieve. The Blitz, he argued, was not only a test of survival but a demonstration that freedom, once threatened, summoned astonishing strength from ordinary people. Late in October, Churchill stood on the roof of the Ministry of Defense during one of the largest night raids yet. London burned beneath him, crimson glows illuminating the river, smoke drifting in thick columns across the sky. He watched silently, hands clasped behind his back, as firefighters battled flames that seemed determined to consume the city. In the distance, searchlights probed the darkness, catching the silhouettes of approaching bombers. The scene was apocalyptic, yet Churchill felt not fear but a solemn, unwavering resolve. He whispered aloud, "We can take it." And in that moment he understood the true significance of the Blitz. The Germans had underestimated the moral armor of the British people. In targeting civilians, Hitler had transformed the entire nation into combatants, not with weapons but with spirit. And that spirit would carry Britain through its darkest nights toward the dawn of resistance. As the autumn deepened, the Battle of Britain reached its decisive turning point. The Luftwaffe, having shifted its attacks from airfields to cities, slowly began to lose the initiative. Fighter Command, bloodied, exhausted but intact, regained the rhythm it had nearly lost in the chaos of August. Churchill monitored every detail from the war rooms, often requesting updated casualty graphs, sortie numbers and intelligence intercepts. What he saw astonished him. Despite the ferocity of the bombardment, the RAF maintained its fighting strength. Aircraft production surpassed losses. Pilot training accelerated without compromising quality. Even morale, the most fragile commodity of war, surged. The young men of Fighter Command had become symbols of national defiance, their daily duels above the English countryside turning into legends before they had even landed their aircraft. Churchill recognized that the survival of Britain now rested upon these few hundred pilots who took to the skies each dawn. It was during this phase that Churchill delivered one of the most iconic tributes in history. On August 20th, addressing the House of Commons, he spoke with heartfelt clarity about the RAF's struggle. His speech had been drafted with meticulous care, yet the key phrase emerged spontaneously during dictation, a simple but immortal line, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The moment he said it, his secretary paused, recognizing its resonance. Churchill meant every word. He knew that these pilots, many of whom had no more than a few weeks' experience, were fighting not just for Britain but for civilization itself. Their bravery, skill and sacrifice had carved a shield across the island's skies. When the speech aired on the radio, thousands of listeners wept openly, not from sorrow but from a profound sense of gratitude. It became a spiritual rallying cry for the nation. Meanwhile, the German High Command grew increasingly frustrated. Losses mounted, aircraft fatigue grew severe, and pilot morale faltered under the relentless pressure. The Luftwaffe had expected a swift victory, believing the RAF to be on the brink of collapse. Instead, they faced an enemy strengthened by a complex system of radar, disciplined command structures, and an island's determination. Goring, furious at these setbacks, demanded more aggressive tactics. Bombers flew deeper into British airspace, hunting industrial targets and railway hubs. But each incursion came at a terrible cost. The sophisticated coordination of Fighter Command meant that British squadrons intercepted German formations with surgical timing, striking at weaknesses the Germans could neither predict nor prevent. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the Luftwaffe's strategy unraveled. Churchill, aware of the shifting momentum, refused to allow complacency. He visited sector stations with increasing frequency, speaking with pilots between sorties, offering encouragement to ground crews, and thanking WAF plotters whose unseen calculations often meant the difference between life and death. He listened as pilots described the exhaustion of repeated combat, the grief of losing comrades, and the surreal beauty of dogfights above cloud tops. Though he never admitted it aloud, these visits weighed heavily on him. He saw in the pilots the sons he might have had, young, brave, and heartbreakingly mortal. Each handshake felt like a farewell in disguise. Yet Churchill also drew strength from them. Their youth, their humor, their irreverent confidence. These reminded him that the war was not a struggle of despair but of fierce, determined life. By early October, intelligence reports confirmed what Churchill had begun to suspect. Hitler was reconsidering invasion plans. Without control of the skies, Operation Sea Lion was no longer feasible. The German Navy, deeply skeptical from the beginning, now opposed the operation outright. The Wehrmacht had suffered delays, frustrated logistics, and mounting casualties in other theaters. And the Luftwaffe, though still powerful, had failed to break Fighter Command. Churchill responded with a mixture of relief and caution. He refused to declare victory prematurely. The Germans, he warned the war cabinet, would likely shift strategies. If they could not defeat Britain from the air, they would attempt to break its industrial capacity, terrorize its population, and force surrender through prolonged attrition. He predicted that the Blitz would intensify, and he was right. Yet even as the bombs continued to fall, the psychological tide of the war began to turn. Britain no longer seemed a beleaguered island awaiting its fate. It had become the immovable obstacle in Hitler's path. Newspapers across the globe recognized the significance of what was unfolding. American journalists wrote admiringly of Britain's steadfastness. The world took notice of the lone democracy that refused to bow. Churchill saw this shift and understood its diplomatic value. He pressed Roosevelt for increased support, arguing passionately that Britain was purchasing time for the United States, time that the Americans themselves would desperately need. The Battle of Britain, he insisted, was not merely a British struggle but a fight on behalf of all free nations. Roosevelt, moved by Britain's endurance, quietly expanded material support. What made this period uniquely powerful was the interplay between battlefield success and domestic resilience. Even as pilots fought for control of the skies, civilians endured the nightly terror of the Blitz. Churchill recognized this parallel heroism and spoke of it often. He saw the courage of firefighters racing toward flames, the calm of families descending into tube stations, the humor of Londoners who painted signs like, "Business as usual," if you can call this usual, on shattered shop fronts. He saw defiance in the smallest gestures: a pot of tea served in a bombed-out kitchen, a shopkeeper sweeping rubble from his storefront before opening for trade, a little girl carrying a gas mask as though it were a school satchel. These acts, ordinary yet extraordinary, convinced him that Hitler had misjudged not just Britain's armed forces, but its people. By late October, the Luftwaffe's momentum had fully broken. German losses continued to outpace production, while British aircraft factories, working around the clock, delivered fresh fighters to the front lines. The balance of air power, once perilously fragile, now tilted subtly toward Britain. Churchill received the figures with quiet satisfaction. He would not celebrate while bombs still fell on British soil, but he understood the meaning of what had been achieved. The Battle of Britain was the first major defeat Hitler's war machine had suffered. It proved that Nazi expansion was neither inevitable nor unstoppable. And it revealed something profound about the island nation Churchill led. When pushed to the brink, Britain did not crumble, it burned with renewed fury. As October drew to a close, Churchill reflected on the extraordinary journey from the dark days of May and June. The evacuation of Dunkirk, the fall of France, the looming threat of invasion, all had led to this moment. Britain had held the line. The skies above the island were still contested, but not conquered. The Prime Minister walked through the dim corridors of the underground war rooms late one night, cigar glowing softly, footsteps echoing. He paused before the great map of Europe, studying the red pins marking German positions. The fight ahead would be long, bitter, and filled with sacrifice. But for the first time, Churchill allowed himself to believe, not merely hope, that Britain might one day win. As 1940 drew toward its final, wind-bitten nights, Churchill carried the burden of leadership with an intensity that seemed almost superhuman. The Luftwaffe continued to bombard British cities, though the rhythm of the attacks shifted with the changing weather. Across the nation, the Blitz's scars deepened, streets reduced to rubble, cathedrals burning against the night sky, families mourning the loss of homes and loved ones. Yet beneath the devastation, something extraordinary had taken root. A national unity that felt immovable, forged by fire and strengthened by defiance. Churchill felt this unity everywhere he went, on bomb sites, in shelters, at airfields. It energized him even as exhaustion gnawed at his bones. Still, he knew Britain remained on a precipice. The country had survived the Battle of Britain, but survival was not victory. Hitler's shadow still stretched across Europe, and Churchill understood that a single grave miscalculation could plunge Britain into disaster. And so, one final meeting, held in the darkest hours of a December night, would become the crucible in which Britain's path for the rest of the war was set. It began shortly after midnight, when Churchill convened the inner circle of the war cabinet in the underground conference room beneath Whitehall. The air was thick with stale cigar smoke and the tension of recent intelligence reports. German bombers had intensified their night raids, shifting increasingly toward industrial targets in an attempt to cripple the nation's production capacity. Worse still, intercepted communications hinted that Hitler, frustrated by Britain's endurance, planned to escalate the war in 1941, perhaps through intensified U-boat campaigns, or by drawing new allies into his orbit. Churchill understood that Britain could not face these threats alone. The nation needed partners, supplies, and above all, time. This midnight meeting was not a conclave of routine strategy. It was the moment at which Britain would decide whether to deepen its defiance or entertain a desperate alternative whispered quietly by some circles in high command: a reconsideration of negotiated settlement should the war worsen further. The room crackled with unease as Churchill outlined the situation with brutal clarity. Britain's reserves of aircraft, fuel, and ammunition were strained to their limits. The U-boat menace in the Atlantic was growing with alarming speed, threatening to choke the nation into submission. The Blitz showed no sign of abating, and winter storms made civil defense increasingly difficult. Some voices in the military establishment, not the war cabinet but influential admirals, generals, and industrial leaders, had begun to murmur about the long-term sustainability of total resistance. Churchill did not name them, but everyone in the room knew their identities. The question on the table was simple and terrifying. Should Britain brace for a struggle of unlimited duration, or prepare contingencies for an outcome in which no rescue came? Churchill stood slowly, leaning heavily on the table, his silhouette long and dark against the dim lamp. He stared at each member of the war cabinet, his eyes blazing with a severity rarely seen even by his closest colleagues. He reminded them, quietly, fiercely, of what Britain had already endured: Dunkirk sands, France's collapse, the infernos of East London, the pilots who fought until their engines sputtered flames, the civilians who crawled from the rubble each morning ready to face another night of terror. Every sacrifice, Churchill argued, would be betrayed if Britain entertained the idea of compromise now. And then he spoke the words that would later be recognized as the heart of the midnight meeting: if we falter now, the world will learn that tyranny need only press hard enough, long enough, to force the last island of freedom to its knees. It was not rhetoric. It was warning. And yet it carried a strange, galvanizing beauty. A heavy silence swallowed the room. For a moment, even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to pause. Chamberlain, frail and fading in health, nodded gravely, signaling support for Churchill's stance despite his earlier hesitations months before. Attlee, calm and analytical, backed the Prime Minister with unflinching resolve. Halifax, still Britain's ambassador to Washington but present that night, remained stone still, his face inscrutable. The meeting's tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. Then, quietly but firmly, Halifax conceded that Britain had crossed the point of no return. Negotiation, he admitted, was no longer conceivable. The specter of his earlier arguments, of peace feelers, of Mussolini's mediation, dissolved in the face of reality. Churchill had achieved what few leaders in history had done. He had shifted not just policy, but the moral foundation of a nation's will. What followed was the decisive turn. Churchill proposed an intensified war plan that, though perilous, offered the only viable path forward. Britain would deepen its alliance with the United States, pursuing every diplomatic channel to accelerate aid. Resources would be redirected to boost aircraft production, expand radar infrastructure, and strengthen anti-submarine operations. New scientific initiatives, including advances in code-breaking, radar miniaturization, and long-range navigation, would receive top priority. Crucially, Churchill ordered preparations for offensive air operations against Germany, believing that Britain must shift from endurance to active pressure. The War Cabinet approved the plan unanimously. The midnight meeting had ended not in despair, but in a profound act of collective resolve. Britain would not negotiate. It would innovate, escalate, and endure. When the meeting adjourned in the early hours, Churchill walked alone down the narrow corridor back toward his private room in the bunker. He was exhausted to the point of trembling, but his spirit burned with renewed certainty. This, he knew, had been the final test, the moment in which Britain might have turned back toward fear, compromise, and defeat. Instead, the cabinet had chosen the harder path, the colder path, the path illuminated not by hope but by conviction. As Churchill reached the small cot in his room, he paused, gazing at a map pinned to the wall. Red pins marked enemy positions. Blue pins showed British forces. The map was bleak, unbalanced, and brutally honest. But for the first time, Churchill felt that history itself had shifted its weight. Britain had survived the summer. It had survived the autumn. And now, in the depths of winter, it had survived its most dangerous temptation, surrender of the soul. He lay down, cigar extinguished, the echoes of the meeting still alive in his mind. Outside the bunker, London's night sky still flickered with distant fires and the low groan of anti-aircraft guns. But within Churchill, something settled into place. The iron certainty that Britain would fight until victory was not only possible but inevitable. The midnight meeting had changed nothing and everything. Britain had already chosen defiance months earlier. Now it chose endurance, strategy, and long-term survival. The war ahead would be long, filled with suffering and sacrifice. But the island would not bend. And in that moment, Churchill understood fully what history would later reveal: that sometimes the most decisive battles are not fought on beaches, in fields, or in skies, but in small, dimly lit rooms at midnight, when the fate of nations hangs in the balance and a handful of voices choose courage over fear.